I was halfway out of my Ford when this absolute screech, hit me from across the gravel, and honestly, it sounded like a hawk getting caught in a blender. Just this sharp, jagged, and quote, "You can oppose. T parked that piece of junk there," and quote, that made my ears ring. I turned around, still holding my keys and a bag of groceries, and saw a woman storming toward me like she was leading a cavalry charge, except instead of a sword, she had a clipboard and this aggressively blonde bob haircut that looked like it had been sculpted out of industrial-grade plastic. Her name was Brenda Vance, the self-appointed queen of the High Ridge HOA, and she was already jabbing a finger at my truck before I could even say hello, telling me that the sight of my, end quote, commercial-grade vehicle, end quote, was a blight on the mountain air, and that if I didn't oppose, hide it in a garage immediately, she'd have the sheriff and a fleet of tow trucks there within the hour. Now, you have to understand, I just spent 25 years as a site foreman down in the city, dealing with actual problems, so watching this woman have a meltdown over a clean F-150 parked on my own damn driveway was almost comical, except for the fact that I bought this cabin specifically to avoid people exactly like her. This place was supposed to be my sanctuary, a little slice of cedar and stone where the only thing I had to listen to was the wind and the ponderosis and the occasional elk. But within 6 months of moving in, Brenda had decided I was her personal project, a rebel that needed to be broken. I just stood there for a second, looking at her oversized sunglasses and the way her mouth was twisted like she just sucked on a bag of lemons, and I realized that to her, this wasn't an oppose. About the truck at all. It was about the fact that I didn't oppose. Looked like the rest of the High Ridge, and quote, elite, and quote, with their Teslas and their manicured lawns that had no business being on a mountain. I leaned against my door, took a slow breath of that pine-scented air, and told her as calmly as I could that since my cabin didn't oppose, actually have a garage, just like every other original lot in this section. My truck was staying right where it was on my property, under my sky. Brenda's face went this shade of purple that I didn't oppose. Think was biologically possible, and she started screaming about Section 8.2 of the bylaws, claiming that, in quote, designated parking, in quote, meant out of sight, and when I laughed, because honestly, what else can you do? She went dead quiet, which is always the part where things get dangerous. She leaned in, her clipboard trembling, and whispered that I was going to regret being so difficult, that people who didn't oppose, respect the, in quote, vision, in quote, of High Ridge didn't oppose, last long. And as she turned on her heel and stomped away, her heels clicking against the stones like a countdown timer, I knew this wasn't oppose, a one-off argument. It was the start of a war I hadn't oppose. Even asked to fight. That night, the mountain felt different, heavier somehow, and I found myself sitting in my darkened living room with a cup of cold coffee, just watching the shadows of the trees stretch across the driveway, while I thought about how a person gets that much poison in their system over a parking spot. Around 2:15 in the morning, I saw the flicker of amber lights dancing against the pines, and sure enough, a flatbed tow truck was creeping up the hill, followed closely by a white Lexus that I knew, for a fact, belonged to Brenda. I didn't oppose. Called the police right then. I just stepped out onto the porch, flipped on the floodlights, and let the heavy barrel of my old Remington 870 catch the light. I wasn't oppose, aiming it, just holding across my chest while I stood there in my flannel pajama pants and boots. The tow truck driver, a kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, slammed on his brakes the second he saw me, and I watched Brenda hop out of her car, screaming at him to, in quote, do his job, in quote, while he just shook his head and started backing that rig down the mountain as fast as the gears would let him. I didn't oppose, say a word, just watch them disappear into the dark. But the next morning, I was at the county sheriff's office with a thumb drive full of high-definition 4K footage from the cameras I'd hidden in the trees the week before, because I've spent enough time on job sites to know that you never trust a person who smiles while they're threatening you. Deputy Miller, a guy who looked like he'd seen everything the mountain had to throw at him, sat there and watched the footage of Brenda directing that tow truck onto my private lot. And he just let out this long, tired sigh before looking up at me and asking if I wanted to press charges for attempted grand theft. I told him I wasn't an oppose, there to ruin a life, just to protect mine. So we agreed on a formal warning, and I actually felt a little bit of satisfaction as I drove back up the ridge, thinking that surely seeing a badge at her front door would be enough to make her back off. But that's the thing about power. Once someone gets a taste of it in a small pond like an HOA, they don into oppos. T just give it up because of an, quote, warning and, quote, they just get smarter about how they use it. And about 3 days later, I found a man in a crisp blue suit standing in the middle of my driveway, measuring the distance from my porch to the road with a laser level. This was Elias Thorne, the HOA's legal pit bull, and he didn't in oppos. T screamed like Brenda. He just handed me a folder and told me, in this smooth, rehearsed voice, that a, quote, recent audit, and, quote, of the original development plats showed that my driveway actually encroached 10 feet on a common HOA land. He told me that the board was willing to be, in, quote, generous, and, quote, and wooed into oppos. T sue me for the back rent on that land if I simply signed over a small easement and agreed to park my truck at the community lot half a mile down the road. And as I look at the maps he'd brought, I could see where they'd literally hand-drawn a new line over the old one, trying to gaslight me into thinking I didn't into oppos. T owned the ground I was standing on. I told Elias to get off my property before I forgot my manners, but after he left, I couldn't into oppos. T shake this feeling of dread, this itch at the base of my skull that told me they were looking for more than just a parking victory. I spent the next few hours crawling around the foundation of my cabin, checking the vents and the crawl space because something felt, and, quote, off, and, quote, and that's when I found it, a small, black plastic box tucked behind a support beam, with a tiny lens pointed directly through a gap in the floorboards toward my master bedroom. My stomach just dropped, this cold, oily feeling of being violated washing over me as I realized they hadn't into oppos. T just been watching my truck, they had been inside my life, and when I found 2 more of those cameras, one in the utility room and one by the back door, I didn't into oppos. T called the deputy. I called a guy I knew from my construction days named Silas, who specialized in digital forensics. Silas showed up with a suitcase full of gear, and within an hour, he tracked the signal from those cameras to a local IP address registered to the High Ridge HOA office, and he found a series of encrypted files that showed they weren't into oppos. T just watching me. They were recording me, logging my hours, seeing when I slept and when I left, all while Brenda was preaching about, in, quote, community safety, in, quote. At the monthly meetings, I stayed away from the cabin for a few days, letting them think I was scared or maybe just busy with work, while Silas and I dug into the HOA's digital archives, and what we found made the parking dispute look like a playground tiff. It turned out that Brenda and a few of her cronies on the board had been, in, quote, adjusting, in, quote, the boundaries of nearly a dozen lots over the last 5 years, slowly shrinking the private land of anyone who wasn't in oppos. T part of their inner circle while creating this, in, quote, phase 2, in, quote, expansion plan that didn't into oppos. T exist in the county records. They were trying to manufacture a scenario where they could claim the land was, in, quote, underutilized, in, quote, or in violation of easements, so they could eventually force a sale to a developer they were secretly partnered with, a group called Apex Heights, and the kickbacks they were slated to receive were in the high 6 figures. This wasn't oppos, T about a messy truck or a blonde bob. This was a coordinated, multi-year racketeering scheme designed to strip mine the equity out of the mountain cabins and hand it over to a corporate entity, and I just happened to be the guy who was, in, quote, too loud, in, quote, to be ignored. The morning the sheriff's department raided the HOA office, I was sitting at a diner in town, eating a plate of bacon and eggs while I watched the news on a small TV above the counter, seeing Brenda being led out in handcuffs with a coat over her head while investigators carried boxes of files out behind her. They'd found more than just my camera feeds. They'd found a, in, quote, hit list, in, quote, of residents who were being targeted for harassment, along with bank statements showing that over $100,000 in community dues had been funneled into a private account in the Cayman Islands. When the news broke, the community didn't in oppos. T just get angry. They woke up, and suddenly all those neighbors who used to look at the ground when I drove by were calling me, asking how I'd caught them, thanking me for standing my ground when everyone else was too afraid to speak up. A week later, we had a town hall meeting that wasn't in oppos. T held in the HOA's windowless office, but out in the central meadow, and as I stood there in front of my neighbors, looking at the faces of people who had been bullied in silence for years, I realized that the, in, quote, queen, in, quote, was gone, but the damage she'd done to the soul of the mountain was going to take a long time to heal. The interim board, which I ended up being part of, mostly because nobody else wanted the headache, voted unanimously to dissolve almost all of the restrictive aesthetic bylaws, meaning people could finally paint their front doors whatever color they wanted and, yes, park their trucks in their own driveways without fear of a midnight tow. We found out that Brenda's husband, a quiet guy named Walter who always looked like he was apologizing for existing, had actually been the one to leak the last set of bank passwords to the DA because he couldn't and oppose. T lived with the guilt of what his wife was doing to the neighbors anymore, and seeing him sitting on his porch now, just staring at the trees, you can see the weight that's been lifted off that house. The mountain is quiet again, truly quiet this time, but every now and then when I'm out on my porch at 2 a.m., I still look down toward the road, half expecting to see those amber lights. And it reminds me that the price of peace is staying just a little bit louder than the people who want to steal it from you. But you tell me, was I wrong to push it that far? Or is there a point where, neighborly, just becomes another word for, victim, And if you found a camera under your floorboards tomorrow, would you call the cops, or would you handle it the mountain way? Leave a comment below, and let me know if you think I was the hero or just another guy with a grudge, because out here, the line between the two is thinner than a pine needle.